Now I'm going to discuss about the venous drainage of the brain. I previously discussed about the arterial drainage. This is video on the venous drainage of the brain. And if we look at the vessels which contributes to the venous drainage of the brain, they can be divided into three main category. One is the superficial veins. The second category is the deep veins. And third categories are the dural venous sinuses. So these are the three group of vessels which supplies the brain. So when it comes to the superficial vessels, as you can see in this picture, there are three group of superficial. The most important are the three group of superficial vessels which are supplying, and I'll name that. So this superficial vein can be there are superior cerebral veins, then there is superficial middle cerebral vein, and there are also inferior cerebral veins. Now if we look in the picture on the left of the screen, so these are the I'll mark. So those in the green where I'm marking, these are the superficial or the superior cerebral vein. They mostly drain into the superior sagittal sinus, which is this one. The next group of vein is obviously the superficial middle cerebral vein, which runs along the lateral fissure or the sylvian fissure, as you can see, and they drain both. In the front they go to the cavernous sinus, and they have also connection with the superior sagittal sinus and also the transverse sinus. The vein which connects from the superficial middle cerebral vein to the superior sagittal sinus is called the anastomotic vein of Trollard. So I'll write it down. So that's the anastomotic vein of Trollard. And the anastomotic vein which connects this superficial middle cerebral vein to the transverse sinus is called the anastomotic vein of Libby. So this is anastomotic vein of Trollard, and this is anastomotic vein of Libby. So the third are the inferior cerebral vein. So these are the veins which is present between the transverse and the sigmoid sinus, which can drain directly into the superficial middle cerebral vein or the transverse sinus. So these are the inferior cerebral veins. So these are the three important superficial supply of the or superficial drainage of the vein on the lateral surface. So these are the superior cerebral vein, superficial middle cerebral vein, and inferior cerebral vein. And there are two anastomotic vein which connects the superficial middle cerebral vein to the superior sagittal sinus and transverse sinus respectively, are anastomotic vein of Trollard and the anastomotic vein of Libby. So this is in short the superficial venous drainage of the brain on the lateral surface. Now now next we are going to discuss about the deep vein. Okay. So deep cerebral vein drains the internal structure of the forebrain. So if we go to the next picture, so if we go to the next picture, so the deep cerebral vein drains the internal structure of the forebrain, and there are two groups of vein which are draining. The first one is the what is called the internal cerebral veins. So internal, so deep group, it has got internal cerebral vein, which is present. So there are two internal cerebral vein present on either side of the midline, and these internal cerebral vein are formed by union of the choroidal vein, which is draining from the choroid plexus, and the thalamostriate veins, which is so this internal cerebral vein is formed by the union of two vein. One is the choroidal vein, and another is the thalamostriate vein. So as the name suggests, choroidal vein drains the choroid plexus, and the thalamostriate vein drains the so this is the thalamostriate veins, as I am so this is draining the thalamus and the striatum. So for example, the caudate nucleus, and so this is the thalamostriate vein. These two vein, this choroidal vein and the thalamostriate vein, join to form the internal cerebral vein, and this internal cerebral vein are present one by the side of the midline. So there is one pair of internal cerebral vein which joins together to form the great cerebral vein. So this is one of the deep. So the internal cerebral vein and the choroidal and the internal cerebral vein join together to form the two internal. One second. The pair of internal cerebral vein join to form the great cerebral vein of Galen, or great cerebral vein. There is also another another vein which join with the internal which joins the great cerebral vein. This is called the basal vein of Rosenthal. Unfortunately, this is not shown in the picture, and perhaps this is the this would be the vein of the Rosenthal, one which I am marking now. So the basal vein of Rosenthal is formed by the union of deep anterior cerebral vein and deep middle cerebral vein. We have seen previously the superficial middle cerebral vein, but this is deep. So this basal vein of Rosenthal, which also join with the great, which also drain in the great cerebral vein, is formed by the union of deep anterior cerebral vein and the middle deep middle cerebral vein. So until now we have seen superficial vein and the deep vein. Superficial vein has got three main parts. One is the superior cerebral vein, which drains mainly into the superior sagittal sinus. Then we have got superficial middle cerebral vein, which drains into cavernous sinus. It drains into superior sagittal sinus through anastomotic vein of Trollard, and inferior cerebral vein So the superficial middle cerebral vein drain into cavernous sinus in the front, and it is also connected to the superior sagittal sinus through the anastomotic vein of Trollard, and the transverse sinus through anastomotic vein of Libby. And then there is inferior cerebral vein, which drains into the superficial middle cerebral vein and also the transverse sinus. So if we draw up if we just recap the venous drainage, so this is the superficial middle cerebral vein, which anteriorly they go to drain into the cavernous sinus. Then we have got the superior cerebral veins, which are draining mostly in the superior sagittal sinus, which is present here. And then we have the inferior So this is our superior sagittal sinus draining into transverse sinus, sigmoid sinus, and to the internal jugular vein. So the superior cerebral vein drain into superior sagittal sinus. The middle cerebral vein drains into the cavernous sinus, and also it drains into the superior sagittal sinus through the anastomotic vein of Trollard, and also it drains into the transverse sinus through the anastomotic vein of Libby. And then we have got the inferior cerebral vein, which drains into the transverse sinus as well as the superficial middle cerebral vein. Superficial middle cerebral vein. And these are the superior cerebral vein, and these are the inferior cerebral vein. So this in short is the superficial supply of the brain. And if we go to the deep supply, as we have discussed, deep supply is the there are two groups of vein which join to form the great cerebral vein of Galen. So there are two groups of vein which are joining to form the great cerebral vein of Galen. It is important to remember the great cerebral vein joins with the inferior sagittal sinus and continue as the straight sinus. We'll discuss about the once we go back to the venous sinus, as I'll show the picture. So that will be the, we'll come to that. But the great cerebral vein of Galen is formed by two group of the vein. One is the pair of internal cerebral vein and a pair of basal vein of Rosenthal. Now the pair of the internal cerebral vein is formed by two veins. One is the choroidal vein, which is draining the choroidal plexus, and then another is the thalamostriate vein, which is draining the thalamus and the striatum, that is the caudate nucleus. And the basal vein of Rosenthal is formed by joining the deep anterior cerebral vein and deep middle cerebral vein. So the great cerebral vein is responsible for drainage of the deeper structure of the if we go back. So if we look at this picture, there are this is the, if I mark it with red color now. So this is the great cerebral vein of Galen, which is formed by two pair of veins. One is the internal cerebral vein, which is formed by union of the choroidal vein and the thalamostriate vein. These are the internal cerebral vein. Along with that, there are a pair of the basal vein of Rosenthal, which is formed by union of the deep anterior and middle cerebral vein. And these two join together to form the great vein of Galen, which will join. And next we will go to the next picture. As you can see, that this will join with the inferior sagittal sinus and joint. So this is the great cerebral vein, which is joining with the inferior cerebral sinus to form the straight sinus, and the straight sinus will eventually join into the confluence of sinus and go on to form the transverse sinus as well. So now we will go to the deep we'll go to the dural venous sinuses. Dural venous sinuses. Okay, the dural venous sinuses are where the deep and the superficial vein drains, and this is a channel which is formed between the two layer of the dura mater. So this is formed in between the two layer of the dura mater, and major venous sinuses are located in the attached border of the falx cerebri and the tentorium cerebelli and the floor of the cranial cavities. So this is the if you recall the meningeal layer. So this is the falx cerebri. It has got a superior margin and inferior margin, and then there is tentorium cerebelli. So the superior sagittal sinus run along the falx cerebri attached to the interior of the cranium, and the free border of the falx cerebri holds the inferior sagittal sinus. So if we look at this, this is the superior sagittal sinus, which is the superior sagittal sinus. It's a line where the falx cerebri attached to the interior of the cranium. So it is attached to the interior of the cranium. That's the superior sagittal sinus. And then you have got the free margin of the falx cerebri, where is the inferior cerebral sinus. So in this picture you can see this is the superior sagittal sinus and this is the inferior sagittal sinus. The inferior sagittal sinus join with the great cerebral vein of Galen, which we have discussed, to form the straight sinus, and then they subsequently join the confluence sinus, which is here, and form the transverse sinus. So this straight sinus along with the superior sagittal sinus join to form the confluence sinus, and then it forms the transverse sinus, which goes to the right and left. Now this transverse or the confluence sinus is also joined by the occipital sinus, which comes from below, and joined to form the confluence sinus. So confluence sinus is formed by the superior sagittal sinus, the straight sinus, and the occipital sinus, and then they are divided into two branches. One is the right transverse sinus and the left transverse sinus, which then forms the sigmoid sinus and go through the jugular foramen to form the internal jugular vein. So these are the important sinus. Apart from that, there is another deep sinus which is called the cavernous sinus. This cavernous sinus lies lateral to the body of the sphenoid bone. It receives blood from the superficial middle cerebral vein and drains into the internal jugular vein via the inferior petrosal sinus, where I am putting the mark, and also the transverse sinus via the superior petrosal sinus. The two cavernous sinus are connected by the intercavernous sinus. These two cavernous sinus, so these two cavernous sinuses are connected on both sides by the intercavernous sinus that lies anterior and posterior to the hypophysis, forming the venous circle around it. The dural venous sinuses are also connected to the extracranial vein by the emissary veins. Okay, so if we recap the about the dural venous sinuses, the deep and the superficial vein drains into the dural venous sinuses, which are channels formed between the two layers of the dura mater. Major venous sinuses are located in the attached border of the falx cerebri and the tentorium cerebelli on the floor of the cranial cavity. So along the line where the falx cerebri attached to the interior of the cranium lies the superior sagittal sinus. This receives blood primarily from the superior cerebral vein and which is present on the lateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere. The free border of the falx holds the inferior sagittal sinus, into which flows the vein on the medial aspect of the hemisphere. So all the medial aspect of the hemisphere drains into the inferior sagittal sinus. And within the tentorium cerebelli, this is the tentorium cerebelli, along the line of attachment to the falx lies the large straight sinus. Into the straight sinus run both the great vein of Galen, which drains the deep structure of the forebrain and the inferior sagittal sinus. So this is the straight sinus where the inferior sagittal sinus and the great vein of Galen join together. The superior sagittal sinus and straight sinus converge at the confluence of sinuses. So this is the superior sagittal sinus and the straight sinus join at the confluence of sinuses which lies adjacent to the internal occipital protuberance. If you remember the skull bone, inside there is internal occipital protuberance where this confluence sinus. From here the blood flows laterally to the either side of the transverse sinus which lies along the line of attachment of the tentorium to the occipital bone. The transverse sinus is continuous with the sigmoid sinus which in turn joins the internal jugular vein at the level of the jugular foramen. Now few words about the cavernous sinus. It lies lateral to the body of the sphenoid bone. It receives blood from the superficial middle cerebral vein and also drains into the internal jugular vein via the inferior petrosal sinus and into the transverse sinus through the superior petrosal sinus. The cavernous sinus also receives blood from the spinoparietal sinus here and the superior and inferior ophthalmic veins. So it receives blood from the superficial middle cerebral vein. It receives blood from the spinoparietal sinus and it also receives blood from the superficial and the superior and the inferior ophthalmic vein. The two cavernous sinus are connected by the intercavernous sinus that lies anterior and posterior to the hypophysis, forming the venous circle around it. The dural venous sinus are connected to the extracranial vein by the emissary vein. So this is in short. So if we just summarize the dural venous sinuses once more. So the dural venous sinuses are situated along the line of the falx cerebri and also the tentorial cerebelli. Tentoriums So these are formed by the between the two layer of the dura mater. These are formed in between the two layer of the dura mater. Now if we look at the meninges, so this is our falx cerebri. This is our tentorium cerebelli. So we have got superior sagittal sinus. We have got inferior sagittal sinus, and these two, the inferior sagittal sinus. So if I now draw, let's make it blue to be more realistic. So this is our superior sagittal sinus. It is coming to the internal occipital protuberance, and this is our inferior sagittal sinus. It joins with the great superior vein of Galen to form the straight sinus. So this is our straight sinus. And this straight sinus goes along the tentorium cerebelli, which is in the occipital bone, and from the transverse sinus, and then it forms the sigmoid sinus, which goes out through the jugular foramen as the internal jugular artery. So there is superior sagittal sinus, the inferior sagittal sinus. Inferior sagittal sinus along with the great vein of Galen forms the straight sinus, which joins with the superior sagittal sinus in the internal occipital protuberance and is called the confluence of sinus. From the confluence of sinus arise the transverse sinus, which goes along the attached margin of the tentorium cerebelli in the occipital bone, and which continues at sigmoid sinus and goes out through the jugular foramen and form the internal jugular vein. On top of that, there are also one important sinus which is called the cavernous sinus. Cavernous sinus is formed by few of the superficial veins. For example, it is the superficial middle cerebral vein. So if this is the cavernous sinus, it is joined by the superficial middle cerebral vein. It is joined by the superior and inferior ophthalmic vein, and it is also joined by the spinoparietal sinus. Because there are two cavernous sinus, they are also joined together by group of, which is called the intercavernous sinus, that lies anterior and posterior to the hypophysis. So it is, if this is the hypophysis, this is the anterior intercavernous sinus, and these are the posterior intercavernous sinus. And this cavernous sinus drains into the main venous sinus through the superior petrosal sinus to the transverse sinus, and the inferior petrosal sinus to the internal jugular vein. And that's how this cavernous sinus drain. So this is in short the summary of the venous drainage of the brain. So if we summarize finally, it has got the superficial vein, it has got the deep vein, and it has got the dural sinus. Superficial veins have got three main: superior cerebral vein, superficial middle cerebral vein, and inferior cerebral vein. These are all superficial cerebral veins draining the lateral surface of the brain. The deep vein are the most important. Deep vein is the great vein of Galen, which is formed by two main veins, pair of two veins. One is the two internal cerebral vein and a pair of basal vein of Rosenthal. Two internal cerebral veins are formed by union of the choroidal vein and the thalamostriate vein, and the basal vein of Rosenthal are formed by the deep anterior cerebral vein and deep middle cerebral vein. Now coming on to the dural sinuses, all the superficial and deep vein ultimately drains into dural sinuses. There is superior sagittal sinus, there is inferior sagittal sinus. Superior sagittal sinus, it drains, it gets its blood mainly from the lateral surface, superior surface of the cerebrum through the superior cerebral vein. The inferior sagittal sinus receive mainly blood supply from the medial side of the cerebral hemisphere. And this inferior sagittal sinus join with the great cerebral vein of Galen to form the straight sinus. And this straight sinus joins with the superior sagittal sinus along with the occipital sinus to form the confluence of sinuses, which then continue onto the right and left side as transverse sinuses, and they go to form the sigmoid sinuses, and finally they go as the jugular sinus or jugular vein when they go out of the jugular foramen. So this is in short the venous drainage of the brain.